Hello, Media-eval listeners. I decided it was finally time to tackle Game of Thrones. But my guest and I had so much to say about it that I ended up deciding to divide it into a two-part episode. So you're now listening to part 1, and part 2 will be released a week from today on August 15th, in what would normally be an off week. However, the regular schedule will continue with another new episode coming out on August 22nd. So please enjoy part 1 of Media-eval's take on Game of Thrones and keep an eye out for part 2 next weekend. Also, I say this in the episode as well, but please do just be aware that spoilers for all 8 seasons of Game of Thrones abound. So you might want to hold off on this particular episode and the continuation next week if you have not yet seen Game of Thrones and would like to do so unspoiled. All right, thanks for listening to Media-eval, a medieval pop culture podcast, where we talk about how medieval and medieval-inspired movies, TV, and books depict the medieval world. What did they get right? What did they get wrong? And what do they tell us about how modern people see the medieval past? I'm Sarah Ifft, a medieval historian, and today I'll be talking about one of the best-known examples of medieval-inspired media, the HBO series Game of Thrones, and to some extent also the book series on which it is based, A Song of Ice and Fire. And as my guest today, I have the person with whom I first got to know both the books and the show, and with whom I have been talking about Game of Thrones for, at this point, I'm pretty sure about a decade. My mom, Beth Greenfeld. Hi, Mom.
Hello, Sarah.
Would you like to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself? I'm sure some of them remember you from the Timeline episode, but if anybody's just starting to listen, they might not, so.
Well, here I am. I'm Sarah's mom, and for many, many years, I've always liked to have the two of us have a mother-daughter book club. Mm-hmm. Since Sarah got interested in medieval stuff, we've read a lot of medieval, popular novels that use medieval history. Historical fiction. And at some point, I got interested in some of the people from the Wars of the Roses because they're underdogs. And then in 2011, I think, there was all this hoopla that the 5th book of A Song of Ice and Fire was coming out. Mm-hmm. And Sarah and I decided we wanted to read that for our mother-daughter book club, though, of course.
Read the series.
Yeah, of course, we had to start with book 1, which we'd never heard of. And we just ran through the 5 books. And then I guess Sarah might have been ahead of me with the movies because I didn't have streaming. I didn't have HBO. So I had to wait till every year was over and then buy the DVDs and then start watching them. Except for the 6th year where I'd call Sarah up and she would tell me the plots.
Right.
So, and then finally, I guess after that, got HBO, and because I didn't want to be the only person in the world a year behind. And that's it. But yes, we have been talking about the book and the movie for years and years and years.
I remember I would tell you the plots, but we had to be careful because Dad did not want to know what happened before he has seen it, so.
Or our friend John, because some of these we did at cafes in Europe.
Right.
And all of Paris could hear what happened that day on the Game of Thrones if they were listening.
Right. And I think that actually was the year when I was very disappointed that I had just narrowly missed being around during Game of Thrones filming, although I'm sure in practice it would have been a pain in the neck. But that was, I think, the season that was partly filmed in Girona, one of my research sites.
Before, because I remember
I left right before.
I remembered your Facebook post that said, I live in Westeros.
Right, because they announced it they announced that as a filming location when I was living there, but I think I left in July and they started filming in September.
And last year, when Americans were still not persona non grata in foreign countries, your father and I went to Ireland, Northern Ireland, and went to a whole lot of the Game of Thrones tours in Northern Ireland and the sites, and it was just wonderful.
Game of Thrones was on HBO from 2011 to 2019. It lasted 8 seasons. The books first began to be published in 1996, are not finished, and I would not bet a lot of money on them ever being finished.
He swears that because of COVID-19, he's making great headway on book 6.
I will believe that when I see it. But as at date of recording, and I'm sure also date of release, there are 5 books and no precise date for book 6, not to mention book 7.
Right. There are chapters here and there, but whether they'll even end up in the final product is unknown.
Right. So a couple of things about the format of today's episode are going to be a little different. One of that is that I am not going to give that full of a cast list, because the cast list for Game of Thrones is its own entire Wikipedia page.
But there's only one character played by 2 different actors, yes or no?
Yeah, that I know of at least.
Okay.
Yeah, Dario Naharis is the only one who I know of who's played by 2 different actors. I can't promise for some of the minor characters. The people that I'll mention are the people that I'd actually heard of when this whole thing got started, which was, of course, Sean Bean playing Ned Stark, and really... So first of all, also everybody, there's going to be spoilers, just general spoilers throughout. The fact that Sean Bean was cast as Ned Stark should have been a clue to all of the people who had not read the books that he wasn't going to make it the whole series. So I'd heard of him. I'd heard of Peter Dinklage as Tyrion Lannister. Michelle Fairley, who plays Catelyn Stark, I actually knew because she was a villain in a season of 24. Yeah.
It's very hard to watch British TV and not come across, oh damn, what's his name? Charles Dane?
Right.
He's
Dance,
in everything. He's in every single series on British TV.
Yeah, including actually one that has been covered on the podcast. He was in the BBC show, the BBC Merlin show, which was kind of funny because he had like a 1-episode arc, or maybe 2 episodes, and was clearly a more talented actor than anyone in the cast.
I remember you saying that, yeah.
I knew Aidan Gillen, who played Peter Baelish / Littlefinger, because he was in The Wire.
Oh, we had tickets to see him in Ireland at the Abbey, but that trip had to get canceled because of the virus.
Right, yeah. But on The Wire, he played the thinly veiled version of your former mayor, Martin O'Malley.
Governor.
Or your former governor, I mean, back when he was mayor of Baltimore.
Yes, and wanted to be president.
Right, and so he played, Tommy Carcetti was the character's name, but it was really just a very thinly veiled, they made him Italian, but it was really just a very thinly veiled version of Martin O'Malley. And, he was very good, but it was very weird to then hear him have a British accent.
Right. And you're going to tell him where you last saw Theon Greyjoy?
Am I going to say where I last saw Theon Greyjoy?
Wasn't he in Elizabeth?
Oh, yeah, so that actually wasn't the last. Yeah, So Theon Greyjoy, Alfie Allen, who plays Theon Greyjoy, I just keep seeing everywhere now. Yeah. And so he was in Elizabeth, and he was in The Other Boleyn Girl.
Oh, wow. He was in Elizabeth with his sister. And they both played little Arundel children. You went to his castle.
Yeah, so they were the little Arundel children, so not actually recognizable. I just saw it when I was looking at the cast list later. But by the time he's in The Other Boleyn Girl, which is a few years after that, but a few years before Game of Thrones, he's old enough that you can tell it's him. And he plays this, basically nothing character. He's like a messenger. He has maybe 2 scenes. And I'm just sitting there saying, I think I said out loud, like, alone to my dog and cat, is that Theon fucking Greyjoy?
That's his name, yes. And of course, Natalie Dormer.
Right, who we knew from The Tudors, from the very short-lived period in which I watched The Tudors before it drove me insane and I couldn't watch it anymore.
That was one of those knowing something about the history made it totally unwatchable.
Oh, yeah. And the other fun one that I found out later in terms of casting that I had seen before but did not know at the time is Rory McCann, who plays the Hound, plays, what's his name? Mike, I think Michael is his name, in the kind of big guy who only says yarp and narp in Hot Fuzz.
Oh, I'd see that movie again just for that.
But, I'd seen Hot Fuzz a million times, and, I've obviously spent a lot of time watching The Hound, and it wouldn't have occurred to me in a million years, and then at some point I just glanced at the cast list and saw that, and was very surprised.
Okay. No, I think we've done a great job with the cast.
Yeah. So, and then of course, I'll just very quickly mention the people who nobody had heard of when this started, but who have since, become kind of developed much more of a career. Lena Headey, who plays Cersei, this has definitely been a kind of good jumping off point, it seems like, for her. It seems like she's doing more things. She'd been in 300 before this, but not a ton, I don't think, of other kind of big name roles. And then the young people, Kit Harington as Jon Snow, Amelia Clarke as Daenerys Targaryen, Sophie Turner as Sansa Stark, and Maisie Williams as Arya Stark seem to be the people who are actually kind of pivoting into having real careers based on this.
Good.
Mostly. I actually don't think Kit Harington is very talented, to be honest.
Oh, no, but people... So one of the things when I've told you this before, when I was going through one of the scenes, the Forest of Tullymore, with a guide, and he said, well, this is the stump Kit Harington sat on. And then he said, tons of women on my tours, and lots of men, they want to go and sit on it and sniff it and rub it. Everybody liked Kit Harington.
He's good looking, but I don't think he's very talented. Yeah. The other thing that is going to be different about this particular episode is that I refuse to do a plot summary, because a plot summary of 8 seasons of Game of Thrones would take 5 hours, 6 hours?
No, I think it would be way more than that, especially if you would jump back and forth with the 5 books. It could take days. It could take longer than the Battle of Blackwater.
Probably would take longer than the Battle of Blackwater. Given that, I am going to be dropping the usual format. We're mostly just going to be having an informal chat about Game of Thrones and what we enjoy about it and what we don't enjoy about it, and ways in which it intersects with history or doesn't quite intersect with history. There will not be a plot summary. However, as said before, there will be spoilers. There will be spoilers going all the way through the 8th season. So if you have not seen Game of Thrones, would like to see Game of Thrones, and would like to not know what happens in advance, if you have somehow managed to not know what happens already and still live in the world and have the internet, then you might want to hold off on this particular episode. Because,
how many people that follow this do you think have not heard of the Red Wedding?
I feel like it can't be that many. I feel like probably basically none, but I feel like it's my duty to warn people.
Because your father heard about it, and he hadn't read one word, seen a minute, it was part of the culture at the time.
Right, and I actually do still feel terrible that, I can't even remember who this was. It was like a friend of a friend. I actually spoiled the Red Wedding for him. Because this was before it had happened in the show. And I think he was reading the books. And so he was I think he was in the middle of the 3rd book. So he was really getting there. And I didn't say everything, but I just kind of burst out well, Robb Stark dies. So yes, I still feel very guilty about that. Although, to be fair, based on how Robb Stark was going, I feel like everybody should have guessed Robb Stark was going to die.
Well, it depends on a bunch of things. If you knew at the very beginning that there were similarities to the Wars of the Roses, you would have known that there would be some repercussions to his not marrying the Walder Frey girl. But nobody, I don't think, could have guessed the Red Wedding.
Right. So actually, why don't we go ahead and move on to actually talking about the Wars of the Roses stuff. I think it's going to keep coming up as we discuss. So I think maybe we should go ahead and talk about that as being, to some extent, the inspiration for the kind of jumping off point. I do just actually want to note that I noticed ages ago and snorted about the fact that Stark and Lannister are a very, very thinly veiled, barely changed version of York and Lancaster. And so, of course, the Wars of the Roses, just basically what it is, for those who have no idea, is that it is a century-long English civil war between sort of 2 families, but it ends up becoming much more complicated. And but the kind of families who are the kind of big claimants for the English throne are the Yorks and the Lancasters. And begins with basically begins with the murder of a king and ends with the murder of a king.
So George R.R. Martin has said that he wanted to write a historical novel based on the Wars of the Roses, but that he would have more fun and more leeway if he just made it a fantasy and could do what he wanted.
Which I get.
Yeah. So people have been casting around since then for historical parallels to the Wars of the Roses.
Right.
Though it's obvious that he'll take from anything in history that catches his fancy.
Yeah, I mean, as we'll definitely get to later, there's a number of things that have obvious parallels that have nothing to do with the time or place of the Wars of the Roses.
I don't see how anybody could look at how John dies and not say, oh, Julius Caesar. Just can't do it. And that, of course, is the end of the books, but be that as it may. Wars of the Roses between the Yorks and the Lancasters, which to my lifelong shame, I didn't realize were very thinly veiled references to Starks and Lannisters. It starts, you can date it either from when Edward III died, but most people don't, and we'll just start it with the major civil war, and let's call it 1455.
Oh, you would start, okay.
Many people started in 1399 when Richard II is deposed and murdered by Henry IV.
Okay, because that's actually when I would have started. But I guess not everybody
when Edward III dies and his grandson takes over, the four brothers are quarreling and infighting and who's going to get to boss around the king most, etc., etc., etc. So, and some people don't like Richard II and call him the Mad King, and then Henry IV is Robert Baratheon, so you could start it there if you wanted. But it's easier to just start it in 1455.
Okay.
When most of these people are around. So, Henry VI is the king. He's been king since he was like 9 months old.
Right.
They married him off to some French woman, Marguerite d'Anjou, and he is, as kings and men go, pretty useless. Mm-hmm. She's pretty much running things. She gets pregnant, whether by him or not, who knows. And
obvious shades of Cersei.
Yeah, and he totally loses his sanity.
So he's arguably Robert Baratheon and Aerys Targaryen are a kind of separated out version of some of the features of Henry VI. Right.
Henry VI could be the Mad King, and he has his son called Edward of Westminster, who's horrible, and that's really all you need to say about that.
One thing I wanted to quickly add about him, Henry as the possible parallel for the Mad King, is also that he is somebody who is known to have a kind of family background with a potential history of mental illness, and that now I can't remember if it's his grandfather or exactly who it is, but he is related to one of the French king who is also seems to have had some episodes of serious mental illness.
I'm Charles, only laughing because his name is Charles, which gives you very little information.
Yes.
Charles the Mad King, married to somebody whose name may begin with a J, or maybe not.
Yes, but Henry VI's mother, was some French royalty or other.
At any rate, the Henrys, the Lancasters, come from John of Gaunt, who is the fourth son of Edward III.
Yes.
The Yorkists come from because he's the third son. The Yorkists come from the second and the fourth.
Right.
So they really clearly have the right, but they didn't depose anybody, so they sort of lost out to the Lancasters. So Richard, Duke of York, is a very nice man, and he would like to be king, but he's not. So he's named Lord Protector, and he makes a deal with the government when Henry is out of things, or with Henry, that he will be Henry's heir. Mm-hmm. That Henry, who doesn't really recognize his son as his own, maybe because of his mental problems, maybe because he knows his wife, that Richard Duke of York and his family will be the heirs when Henry VI dies.
Right.
Henry VI comes out of his mental stupor, and that gets abrogated. Mm-hmm. And then there are all these wars really run by Margaret of Anjou on one side and the Yorkists on the other. Richard the Duke of York is killed in a battle, and his son Edmund, his second son, he lost. He's just standing there on a bridge waiting to be taken prisoner, and they just cut his head off. And it was something you're not supposed to do.
I mean, for the nobility in particular, that when you have nobility who kind of surrender through proper channels,
you're no longer fighting a battle; it's a prisoner.
Yeah.
So you're not supposed to be going around beheading prisoners, let alone 17-year-old boys. So they take his head, they take his father's head, and they put them on pikes at Micklegate Bar in York. So it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Everybody's trying to get to London. And the eldest son of Richard, Duke of York, called Edward, he gets to London. Marguerite d'Anjou had sort of been going, but they said, you're a French bitch, we don't like you, we're not letting you into London. And even though Edward lost his previous battle, Edward comes to London, and they open the doors.
Right.
Because they like him. Very nice guy, very cute, very rich.
And the Londoners pretty consistently often in kind of battles between English kings very much just sort of do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah, and that was it. When they opened the gates, I mean, that's what somebody could break, and nobody was laying siege to London. At any rate, so he's there. They sort of offered him the crown, and then in 1461 they have Towton, which is the absolute bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Mm-hmm. And they are literally still finding bodies.
Right.
And the bodies they have found show people have whacking them in the head even after they were dead. It was nasty. But at any rate, in part thanks to the Earl of... This is the problem. Mm-hmm. It's written Warwick. It's pronounced Warwick.
Right, it's as the English do.
Yeah, so I will probably say Warwick,
Worcester, etc.
And then everybody can, write in and complain. At any rate, so Warwick is on his side. They win Towton. Edward is the king. And everything is great for like 10 years. Then for various reasons, Warwick defects. He collects the next brother of Edward, and Edward is deposed. They go to Burgundy, then they come back. Then in 1483, Edward just dies, though nobody knows why. It might have been, cirrhosis. By that time, he'd been like womanizing, drinking and eating much of the time. But at any rate, they're back and forth battles. He's fine. He's been king. He dies. Somebody comes forth and tells the next brother who's still alive, Richard, that this will sound familiar. That Edward had a pre-contract and wasn't really allowed to marry Elizabeth Woodville. That he married because he didn't feel like marrying the French princess that he was supposed to marry, which is one of the reasons all his allies left him. And they tell him his children are all illegitimate. They can't be king. And the parliament passes, you'll have to correct me on this, Titulus Regius. That's how it's spelled, right. Titulus Regius. Yeah. That disinherits the boys because they're not legitimate. And Richard III ends up taking the crown. And then a pretender from across the sea who claims he's descended from King Arthur and has a red dragon on his coat of arms. Like, who had a three-headed red dragon on her banner? Well, King Arthur only had one head, and Henry Tudor, who's a total pretender, has no right to the throne. He comes with his foreign guys and beats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth.
Well, his claim is through his mother, right, who's descended from that third of the sons, John of Gaunt.
The problem is, John of Gaunt had a wife, she died. Then he had another wife, I guess she died. Though the descendants from those two are royals from Castile and Portugal, and they have a claim to the throne, though they don't seem to notice. John of Gaunt spends 25 years having an affair with Catherine Swynford. They seem to have been very happy together. I think that's the Catherine from the Anya Seton book, Catherine.
Right.
And they have however many children they have, and they are illegitimate.
Right.
They are eventually legitimized. Yeah. But there is still an act of parliament that says that even though they're legitimized, they can never, never, never be the rulers of England. And that was never, never, never repealed.
Right. And that's where his mother comes from.
Right.
And his father is a Welsh nobody.
His grandfather, I think.
Well, his father's also a Welsh nobody.
Yeah, well, yeah, and so is his uncle. But no, that's... the father is the... Okay, so...
Although, yes, the father is the one who...
Catherine of Valois?
Yes, so
Catherine of Valois is Henry VI's mother. Then her husband dies, and she has an affair with this Welsh guy.
I think they do get married.
They do. So he's the Tudor guy, and then Henry the, I guess, 7th comes from him. But Henry Tudor comes from across the sea and beats Richard in 22nd of August, 1485 at Bosworth. And they always said that they threw Richard into the river, but it seems to be a lie. Not the first, not the last lie, Henry Tudor tells. The monks, I think, or somebody took Richard's body and buried it in what is now a parking lot, and that was discovered 4 years ago or something like that. And then Henry Tudor just does something disgusting. He says, well, I didn't become king when I beat Richard at Bosworth. I really became king the day before the battle. So if you fought against me at the battle, you're a traitor.
Right.
But remember when we met the descendant of somebody who fought for Richard at Bosworth when we were buying books in London?
Yes. I'm actually just going to quickly mention the thing that you didn't mention, and just because, again, I know why you didn't mention it because you don't like it, but people, it'll be familiar to people, and so they need to have it mentioned. Richard III, who was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, is subsequently accused by Tudor supporters of having murdered these two sons of his brother Edward, who were declared to be illegitimate. So if you have heard of the princes in the tower, that's who this refers to, and that's why Richard III in the writings of Shakespeare, who is, of course, essentially, he's supporting a Tudor monarch and is basically a propagandist. That's why he presents Richard III as very much a kind of unequivocal villain.
Right. So the princes were brought to the tower because that's really where people were. I mean,
it's not only
it was not never a prison. Only a prison. That's where Anne Boleyn was for her coronation. It was a palace as much as anything else. And after a certain time, nobody saw the kids. For a while, they had seen them playing on Tower Green, like exactly the place where they then cut people's heads off, but it's also a place for kids to play when they're not cutting people's heads off. And then at some point, nobody saw them again. And many people have always said Richard III killed them, though he had no reason to, because Parliament had already declared them illegitimate. They were 4 of the children. Their mother didn't seem to be really worried about Richard. She sent her 3 daughters to stay with him.
Right.
And they have the same legal rights as their brothers do. If they were killed, there are certainly a number of other candidates, including Henry Tudor's mother. And then it really, people gossip, but it really got a life of its own from a book by the Saint Thomas More, who was like 5, but makes believe he was there. And then Shakespeare totally vilifies Richard III. If you can think of something bad that occurred when he was alive, he's blamed for it.
Right. So that was just something that I, people should certainly kind of have mentioned. And there is, because I think, especially because also there are a number of kind of potential parallels that kind of fit in odd places to potentially the Princes in the Tower, so.
Right. So one of the weird things about the parallels is that he takes this piece of a famous Wars of the Roses, and puts it in this character. Then he takes a different little piece and puts it in this character. So there's no true, absolute one-on-one correlation. So I might as well start with Richard. There are at least 3 characters in Game of Thrones, maybe 4, that are based on different aspects of Richard III. The first is Ned Stark. The noble, honorable men from the north.
Yes, York, of course, being in northern England.
Yes, though it's interesting, until Richard III, York and much of the north went for the Lancasters.
Right.
So, York was not always Ricardian and Yorkist. I was very surprised.
In some ways, I actually think the extreme regionalism and elements of the regionalism, I actually don't think have a lot in common with England in the 15th century. I think it actually looks much more like the Iberian Peninsula or the Italian Peninsula.
But the heads of his father and brother were on Micklegate Bar in York for months, if not years. Margaret Andrew was not there. There was not a reason in the world the people of York could not have just taken him down. And nobody did. Now, of course, the whole place is unbelievably pro-Richard III, but they certainly weren't before he was sent there to, tame them. But at any rate, so the first one is Ned Stark, the noble honorable man of the North.
King of the North.
King of the North. He actually was called Lord of the North. That was one of his titles.
It actually is. I remember I took a bus not directly to York, but I took a bus to Leeds for a conference and took this interminable bus ride from London, which I never should have decided was a good idea. But I took this bus ride, and I remember, though, it being very interesting, the extent to which you really do enter, and it says the North in all caps on the English road signs, on the highway as you get into that area, and it feels very weirdly oh, this is what would happen with Westeros in the 21st century.
Yeah, no, I loved it because they're on the right side there. Though they did let you vote. They had, up in Micklegate Bar, they had an exhibit, very low-key, cheap exhibit, but at the end of it you could vote who you thought really murdered the princes.
Right.
But yeah, the poor princes. Yeah, even now, though, they're lying about them. The last time we went to the tower, the guide said, oh yeah, and they found the bodies and they proved it was the princes because they did a DNA test. It's just a lie. Elizabeth did not agree.
Right.
No DNA. They were both named as regents on the deathbed of their various kings. What's his name? Baratheon said to Ned Stark, you can be the regent, and Edward IV did the same thing. Both of the men declared the boys illegitimate and said that the next brother in line is the true king. It just so happened that when Richard said that, he was the next
He was the brother, right. So as much as I like Richard, it comes off a little less selfless.
It is. Allegedly, they had to talk him into it, but somebody's got to be king, right? And Ned Stark is also linked with the Richard Duke of York, because they're all noble, decent people. And also the protector of the realm. At any rate, so Ned Stark is the first one. Yay, Ned. The second one is Stannis Baratheon, because he was the next in line, and he's the one who said, hey, I just found out these kids are illegitimate. I win. I'm the next king.
Yeah.
And he was a great military leader. He seems to have certain personality characteristics with Richard. Letter of the law, guys. That horrible thing where Davos keeps saying, isn't Stannis wonderful? He cut off my fingers? Because that was the law.
Right.
So they're both very loyal to their brothers, Stannis and Richard, and then you have these succession crises, and it's a mess. The difference between Stannis and Richard III is that Stannis actually killed his brother.
Right.
And
well, not that brother, the other brother.
He killed the next brother, Renly.
Right.
And while Richard is accused of killing his brother George, Duke of Clarence, thanks to Shakespeare, he did not.
Right.
The third is, so Stannis is, quote, the historical Richard III, and Tyrion is, quote, the Shakespearean Richard III. I mean, Shakespeare made Richard into this vile hunchback, and at least at that time, if there's something that wrong with you, you're probably evil too. I don't know whether...
Right, that is the belief that physical deformities were a manifestation of internal evil, essentially.
Easy to demonize. And then I guess when they dug him up, they found out he had scoliosis.
Right.
But it's also proven that all the oil paintings of Richard that we have were doctored by the Tudors to make one shoulder really much higher. I mean, they can prove that with oil painting radiographs or whatever they use.
Right. So even though obviously, if he were in some ways, disabled, obviously that would have been fine and all good. But there's also no evidence that he was in a visibly noticeable way.
Right, he probably was. I think with the scoliosis was probably one shoulder, but not like it is.
But that it was subsequently dramatically exaggerated.
Wasn't 100. I mean, I can still see the last times I saw Michael Moriarty, like one hand dragging on the floor and the other side like this. No, not true. So they both have physical issues. Tyrion and Richard III, they're both talented administrators. They're both hands or protectors of their nephews. They were both charged with killing their nephews, but as far as I'm concerned, Tyrion didn't, neither did Richard III.
We've already talked about Richard III, and Tyrion is, in fact, exonerated by things.
Right.
I mean, we know that he's not the one who's responsible. Although if he had been, you really wouldn't have blamed him.
Right. They both did. No, it would have been a mitzvah. They both did one thing that's very discomforting. Tyrion gets Varys killed. And whether or not Varys was really a traitor, which he probably was, it shouldn't have been done. And Richard III did the same. It was right before he was king with his friend Hastings, who was a traitor, and he was in cahoots with Jane Shore, we'll get to her later, and Elizabeth Woodville, who's Edward IV's wife, and they're running messages back and forth to kill Richard and put the kids back on the throne. And they're having what we call a privy council meeting, but it won't call that yet, I don't think. And he says, Hastings, you did this. And Hastings says, yes, I did. And Richard says, you're a traitor. Take him out to Tower Green and cut his head off. And they said, we don't have a block. Oh, we're not ready. He says, find something. And it just wasn't right. And the Ricardians worked so hard to say, well, he had to do it in the heat of the moment, because if he had thought about it, he wouldn't have done it. Well, yeah, that's fine. But that was an ugly moment for both of them, killing someone they had been so close to for so many years. It was bad. So that's the Richard III characters.
Yeah.
Edward IV, who was king before Richard III, started out his life. Oh, he was young. He was gorgeous. Everybody loved him. He won all these battles. He overthrew the bad king and became the good king. He was great. The early Edward is the early Robert Baratheon.
Right.
Then Edward screws up and marries Elizabeth Woodville. He didn't think he screwed up. But anyway, at some time, it cost him his throne, cost him his allies, yada, yada. So that Edward is obviously Robb Stark.
Right.
Except that Robb Stark really lost literally everything, and Edward just loses his throne for a while, and then he gets it back.
And gets it back, right.
Seems to have loved his wife very much. But he still womanizes. He's got a gazillion, what do you call them?
Mistresses?
I don't like that word.
Side pieces?
He's sleeping with 1 million women, in his castle. He's not renting a pied-à-terre. They just come to the... And then he's got 1 million girlfriends. He's got 1 million girlfriends. He drinks too much. I know you say it's fat shaming, but he's getting fat, stupid, drunk, womanizing, and then, wow, he's Robert Baratheon again.
Right.
Except that I think he and his wife really did love each other, which you can hardly say for Cersei. But yeah, so he sort of starts out as Robert, gets into Robb Stark for a while, and then Robert is him at the end.
Yeah.
The early him and the later. The other giant parallel is Cersei. The problem with Cersei is that her arc is, I am like a medieval queen. I don't have any power. I had an arranged marriage to this guy, whether because he loves someone else or whatever. He certainly doesn't love me. Our sex life sucks. But one way or another, I have these children, and I love my children, and even if I didn't love my children, if I put my little kids on the throne, I will have power behind them. From the Wars of the Roses, she really is the same as Marguerite d'Anjou.
Right.
Both of them are hated. They're just not nice women. There's something about the purple wedding where Marjorie says, let's give the food left over to the poor, and Cersei won't do it. No, nobody likes either of these women, but they're obviously very, very, very talented in their power-hungry ways.
Extremely intelligent and capable administrators.
Absolutely.
And good politicking.
And they both have truly hideous sons.
Right.
So Edward of Westminster, who I can't remember how old Joffrey was when he dies. Edward of Westminster, thank God, never had any power. But even, I guess, the ambassador of Milan says this kid talks of nothing but wanting to kill people and cut off their heads.
Right.
You know, he was a horrible person, this Edward of Westminster.
So clearly very akin to Joffrey.
Right. But because of the power dynamics and of what women could do and couldn't do, and the problem of arranged marriages, you can also make a case for her being an avatar of Isabel the She-Wolf, Catherine de Medici, Catherine the Great, for a big stretch, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who all in all seems to have had the happiest marriage of all of them, even though her husband put her in jail for 20 years.
Right.
And the other possibility, which I really love, is that she has things in common with Thomas Cromwell. The whole way she got rid of Marjorie, the legal part, before she blew her up, is so similar to how Cromwell got rid of Anne Boleyn. Down to, let's torture the musician.
Right.
Unbelievable.
And Marjorie, who played Anne Boleyn, also having a number of parallels with Anne, including that she is falsely accused of sleeping with her brother, whereas of course Cersei is correctly accused of sleeping with her brother. But...
Right. Though now everybody says that George Boleyn was closeted gay, which may or may not be true, but everybody is saying that now, as what Loras is.
Right.
The other thing I'm going to say about Cersei is the Walk of Shame.
Yeah.
The Walk of Shame is clearly what happened to Jane Shore. She's the one who was Edward's mistress, and then after he died, she joined with the other people.
Right.
She was actually everybody's mistress. She was Hastings' mistress. She was the mistress of Thomas Grey, who I think was Edward IV's wife's son by a previous marriage. And she was the go-between because everybody trusts women and lets them just wander around carrying secret messages. And sometimes they do it. They're in the French Resistance and they're great. And sometimes they're trying to get rid of Richard III and they're not. But at any rate, he really had her for treason. She's interesting also because Edward helped her divorce her husband for impotence. And that doesn't happen every day.
No, although it is interesting. It is definitely something that could happen. There's like some really interesting canon law debates about under what circumstances you believe women and to what extent they need to be then examined.
Right.
On the assumption that, okay, if your husband's impotent and you were supposed to have been a virgin when you were married to him, then you should still be a virgin, etc.
I think he was in on it. He got a lot of estates. But at any rate, so she's carrying on with everybody, and then she's carrying messages, and they all get caught. And she's arrested. They really seem to have a thing about let's not execute women. So Richard instead decrees, he doesn't do anything about the treason. She's sort of been accused of witchcraft, doesn't do anything about that. He says, well, you're very lewd. Very lewd. And he was really, as I said, like Stannis, real prude. So the prude called her lewd and makes her take the walk of shame. Right. And she's walking the streets in the kirtle, her outfit, not totally revealing, but not really a cover-up.
Not nude the way Cersei is in the Walk of Shame, but in what's essentially the equivalent of underwear.
She doesn't even have any shoes because her feet are ripped up. But she's educated, and she goes through her walk, and nobody's bothering her. And she goes through the walk reciting prayers in Latin.
Good for her.
Yeah. So that's the Walk of Shame. Yes. Recited prayers. Well, that's what the Saint of Thomas More says, so who knows?
So actually, I am going to pause you because that's actually, I think, a good lead in to talking a little more about some things that I have to say about women and gender in Game of Thrones. One of the things that I actually have always liked about Game of Thrones is the fact that they have a number of examples of powerful women who exercise power in ways very similar to the ways in which real medieval women exercise power. So as we already talked about, there are multiple analogs in some ways for Cersei, but not just Cersei. There's Olenna Tyrell, is somebody who's this kind of family matriarch who clearly, despite the fact that she never actually rules, she clearly exercises a great deal of power by being this kind of family matriarch. Catelyn Stark, who clearly is extremely influential, well-respected most of the time by her son.
That's why they match her up with Cecily Neville, who is the mother of Edward, Clarence, Richard, etc. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So that she's somebody who is very kind of influential and clearly also, to some extent, was somebody whose advice her husband had respected as well.
Right.
And of course, Sansa Stark, who eventually does end up kind of by the end sort of reigning in her own right as the daughter of a king, which is something that happened, not always, but occasionally, but that she has a sort of complicated route to establish and exercise power, including the fact that people who have a less strong claim than her, their claims are often taken more seriously. So while it is not exactly the same in many ways, the fact that Sansa, has a much better claim than Jon, but Jon is initially taken more seriously and acclaimed as king in the North. That's very akin to things that really did happen in the Middle Ages. So, for example, not Wars of the Roses much earlier, but Matilda, right, who is the daughter of the king, the daughter of King Henry I. Her father very clearly expects and wants her to reign after him, and she is clearly the best claimant, but ultimately ends up basically losing out to a cousin, essentially because they don't want her because she's a woman. And so this man is considered to be having more serious claim.
But it's the Wars of the Roses too, because Henry marries the daughter of Edward IV, and by now he's gotten rid of the Edward IV. Yeah.
Henry VII marries
Henry
There's a lot
Tudor,
of Henrys. So.
Yeah, and you can't call him the usurper. He marries Elizabeth, who's the daughter of Edward IV. He's gotten rid of Titulus Regis. She's clearly the next in line for the throne.
And that's actually really what Ramsay Bolton does when marrying Sansa. So that might be controversial in some circles, saying that Ramsay Bolton and Henry Tudor are the parallels, but but that's very much what he does.
Actually, I love it.
Is that he marries the person. So in the show, it is, of course, Sansa. In the book, by the way, for anyone who's listening, in the book, it's not Sansa. It's some woman basically that they grew up with, who is then passed off as being Arya, but is not Jane Poole. But regardless, he attempts or successfully marries the person who actually has the claim to the title that he wants to hold as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. But anyway, to go back in general, in the medieval world, it is, again, it's relatively uncommon, but not unknown, that there are women who do rule entirely in their own right. And in particular, there's a number of examples from the Iberian Peninsula. But you really do see women exercising power in the main way that women really did exercise power, that essentially they do so in a variety of ways through their husbands and sons. They hold positions as regents. They hold, in many ways, kind of Catelyn Stark as kind of this kind of figure who's almost acting as a sort of lieutenant almost of first her husband and then her son. And, that's something that actually also has Iberian parallels. It also has French parallels. Blanche of Castile.
Maria Guise.
Right, Marie de Guise. That there are a huge number of interesting, powerful women who I think, there are clearly a lot of parallels in a kind of broad sense. And I think overall, Game of Thrones does a good example of that. And if you even kind of go a few levels down and talk about women's lordship as opposed to queenship, then there are even more potential examples that it was, in fact, not especially uncommon even for women to essentially be lords in their own right. That didn't have quite the same complicated political dynamics as women being reigning queens. And so, Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, so she's never a reigning queen of England. She is the reigning lady, but essentially reigning lord of Aquitaine. And it's very clear that in Aquitaine, they don't care what either of her husbands have to say about anything. They care about her.
Or which
that
they're
they consider
married
her
to.
their lord.
She's married to. They don't care.
Right, yeah. I mean, they don't, yeah, like neither Louis VII nor Henry II are considered ever by the nobles of Aquitaine to have any real meaningful authority over them. And so the show has a lot of great examples of women exercising power in realistic medieval ways, and
Lady
also of
Mormont.
kind of, yes, right. Yeah, and also of like having power often, but not exclusively through men. And I think that it does a really good job on that in a lot of ways.
But otherwise, if you're not a queen or a lord, you're a prostitute. I see that.
Yeah, so that's the big problem that I have with the show, especially as somebody who does medieval social history and works mostly on women who are of kind of the middling classes. That, and I'll get to the fact that those classes are essentially absent, but that is the thing that's very frustrating, is that you're either a princess or a prostitute in Game of Thrones. And the only real kind of working women and the only other women besides these elite noble women are prostitutes. And there are a lot of prostitutes.
Two less than there were at the beginning of the show, thanks to Joffrey.
Right, and including like in the early seasons especially do this like bizarre thing where they have these like exposition prostitutes, where you have people explaining basic things about the plot or their motivations while they're fucking a prostitute, or while two prostitutes are fucking each other. And so like we find out like half of like the basic stuff, like Littlefinger basically explains like everything about who he is while like directing two prostitutes to have sex with each other, which is extremely gratuitous.
The only other woman who has a, quote, middle-class job, though we don't like her, is the Dothraki, the witch. She has a real job.
Yeah, that she's this kind of healer woman, right? And that, that is a job.
And that's it.
Yeah. But that other, and I guess actually there's the waif, Arya's nemesis in Bravos.
There's all the Bravos women, actually, because there's the waif, there's the actress.
Right, yeah. So outside Westeros, there are more examples.
Which is weird.
Yeah, that is interesting. But you definitely do not have any, you don't have anywhere the examples of the kind of real life, like there are women who were merchants in various places. There's a ton of women who were involved in the textile industry.
Even landlords. There's nothing.
Yeah, and then at least we kind of see servants here and there, but we don't actually hear anything about them.
No brewers.
Right, exactly. Like women control as we've talked about before, women control the brewing trade. Women in England, women in Catalonia actually controlled the baking trade. And so we have all of these, so like hot pie should have been a girl. That actually would have, potentially made a lot of sense. So that is definitely something that's very frustrating, is that you don't have any of these women, any of these working women who have agency and who have jobs. You just have these kind of vaguely oppressed prostitutes. And that's the thing too, is that also, we know a lot about medieval sex work, and I actually don't even think it's an especially good representation of medieval prostitutes who, had a lot of interesting kind of solidarities between one another. There's been a lot of great work about like prostitutes and their relationships with one another, and how they thought about themselves and their honor, and actually that they did have a concept of honor. Like there's a lot of great stuff and interesting stuff that you could actually say about prostitutes that's also not in this either. The prostitutes in Game of Thrones are really, they're really just sex objects.
Oh, and the other person, of course, is Brienne.
Yes, who, to the extent I would say that Brienne has a parallel, there really are relatively few women who have a kind of military involvement. The closest parallel, I think, is probably Joan of Arc.
That's the only one, yeah.
And maybe arguably some of the kind of Viking warrior women, although that gets complicated because we don't actually know exactly how many of them are real as opposed to just things that show up in legend.
But they never compare her in all the research I've done to somebody like, I can't pronounce her name either, Boudicca, whatever her name is. The one who she really didn't like the Romans and burnt down London. She was very...
Right.
But she has a whole history of rape too, so maybe we don't. But yeah, no, the Brienne thing is mostly parallel to Joan of Arc, but really mostly because she's wearing men's clothes and armor, nothing else. And I guess she calls herself the maid, and Joan is the maid. And that's really it. If that's all you can do for a woman in armor as an avatar, that's pathetic.
I mean, well, because there weren't actually a lot of women in armor who really had military training and skills. That wasn't something that, in the medieval world was typically done. And so it's, very unusual circumstances like Joan of Arc, who basically had a bunch of visions.
Right.
And said that this is what God wants me to do. Or it's, as I said, in the Viking context, there's a lot of back and forth right now. There are some people who would say that the kind of allusions to warrior women are really something that's legend, and there's not an evidence for them really existing in reality.
Well, there are the Amazons. They're real.
I actually don't know exactly what the background is of the Amazons, but...
Well, I did some reading of it. I don't remember. Oh, in that book I told you about, Antigone Rising.
Mm-hmm.
She said she has a chapter on the Amazons, and I think she assumes that they're real, and that Roman men really hated them. And it's a mark of honor to go out and kill an Amazon. And now they have all of them on, those vases and on things like the Elgin marbles. Yeah, let's go kill an Amazon, the girls.
Right.
But I think they were also afraid of them, and they were great warriors.
Yeah.
But I think they were real. I think people believe in them.
Yeah, and the Vikings, as I said, there certainly is potentially, I would say, some pretty good evidence that there probably were some people who were biologically female or assigned female at birth, at least, who are warriors, although some of them might not have entirely identified as women. There's actually been some really interesting research on that.
Yes, and I bet there have always been women who dressed up as men and went to war.
There certainly are. So actually the interesting thing is I'm sure there were, but there's actually most of the really prominent stories of women cross-dressing in order to pursue an alternate path. Those are actually women who became monks.
Oh, and then there was the one who became a pope.
We're not going to get into
Pope Joan, of course. I forgot about Pope Joan.
There's, of course, not evidence for Pope Joan being a real thing.
If our descendant says my great-great-grandmother was Pope Joan, there you go. But I think women were doing that at least as recently as the Civil War.
Right, and there's a great story. There's a Saint Wilgefortis, who basically was supposed to marry some dude and didn't want to, and prayed to God about it, and God gave her a beard.
Yeah, the bearded lady. Yeah.
Yeah, so she wouldn't have to get married.
But yeah, no, it just seems to me that women would always have done that. I mean, I have absolutely no proof for that whatsoever, except for the Civil War, and I'm sure they did it before then too.
Right, and there's certainly, as I said, there's a decent amount of evidence for women who dressed as men and men who dressed as women for various reasons. Some are people that we might, at this point want to kind of identify as being trans. Some are not. Brienne is not, I would say.
No. But that is one of the best speeches in the show, which is Cersei's when she's sort of emotionally torturing Sansa during the Battle of Blackwater.
Right.
But she goes through this thing about my brother learned to be a warrior and I learned to sew. And he inherits and I got sold off to a pig. And just that whole thing about I should have been born a man, then I could do what I want to do. It was very moving, even if you don't like her. And she was horrible in that scene. She was so mean to Sansa. That speech was very moving. And
that's actually, I think Cersei is a brilliant character. And I low-key kind of like Cersei, to be honest. In part because I think she is actually, she's extremely intelligent. She's always very good at what she does. And, there are a lot of ways in which she is, very compelling. And I could watch an entire, 8 seasons of just Cersei drinking and looking out a window and being a bitch. I would watch that.
Just looking out the window makes me crazy. It depends why she's looking at the window, watching wildfire destroy the sept, that was very satisfying. That was a good view.
I could watch 8 seasons of Cersei the mean drunk.
Okay. Well, not when she was so mean to Sansa.
Well, but that's actually what I was going to say, is that I actually think that scene is so brilliant because she's very much talking about how she feels that she should have been equal to Jaime and that she should have been treated the same way as Jaime. But that doesn't actually translate at all to her having any kind of solidarity with or respect for other women.
Right.
And that in particular, she basically says, at some point, she's basically I was sold off like a pig. And then Sansa says, but you were Robert Baratheon's queen. And she goes, yeah, you'll be Joffrey's, good luck.
The only thing I'm going to say about that episode,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, before I say anything else, is that it was, I think it was written by George R.R. Martin.
Oh,
he wrote, I think, like one a year or something. But at any rate, no.
Well, then I'm going to comment on later on the fact that he got rid of the best part of it. So
no, but he kept the best line. I would go out and seduce Stannis if it would do anything, but I'd have better luck seducing his horse.
No, I mean, she's great. I think actually Lena Headey's performance in that episode, I think is fantastic. I think she is very much in a lot of ways, like in an episode that is interesting, I think she is actually really the high point and the kind of emotional center in a lot of ways of that episode.
She is, and she's also one of the best performers from beginning to end. She really doesn't miss a beat. She's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, Lena Headey, I think, is a fantastic actress. And as I said, I kind of like Cersei, and I really enjoy Cersei the mean drunk in this episode. But I do actually think the way in which she relates to Sansa and simultaneously recognizes aspects of her own experience in Sansa, but very much has no feelings of solidarity associated with that, actually feels unfortunately very true to a lot of elite medieval women. And I mean, to some extent, I think that's kind of one of the problems and one of the reasons that, we don't have real attempts to achieve anything like gender equality, is that intelligent, talented, elite women basically continue to just focus on maintaining their own power with an alliance with men, and never had any kind of real solidarity with other women or any kind of sense that basically women should have more things available to them as opposed to I should have more things available to me.
Right. And the other problem is what I was sort of half referring to before. For whatever reason, she will not rein in Joffrey.
Right. Which also I think is... I think that is something that feels true to me to some extent, is that the kind of dance and balance of power very much is one in which she is reliant on Joffrey for her power.
Right. But I can't remember which queen it was. Oh, it was somebody in France or something. It was fighting with Marjorie Tyrell for power over Joffrey, who would have the most, was the same as, Catherine de Medici, whose son was married to Mary, Queen of Scots.
Right. Yeah.
And it's the same thing, you have too much power over my son. I want the power over my son. So then there's certainly no solidarity there. If you're always in competition, whether there's anything to compete over or not.
It's actually also not dissimilar. I unfortunately cannot remember the other woman's name, but it's actually not dissimilar to how Blanche de Castile related to her son Louis IX's wife. That very much it was essentially she treated it as a zero-sum. It was something de Provence, but I can't remember. Maybe Marguerite de Provence.
I don't remember. I just remember the thrones, not the thrones.
Right, then if you go to Sainte-Chapelle, I mean, it's
so that's that. What do you call that? The Crown of Thorns, not Game of Thrones.
Yes,
Crown of Thorns.
So Sainte-Chapelle is where they located the Crown of Thorns
and
relic,
it was her and her son.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because that is what is very much emphasized. Is essentially it's almost this ode to a mother-son relationship, and there's actually some interest. There's an interesting book about the windows of the Sainte-Chapelle, which talk about the kind of windows that involve Judith and Esther as models for queenship, and Judith, the much more active one, being the one that she then associates with Blanche of Castile, and Esther, the much more passive one, being the one that she associates with Louis's wife, whose name I am not entirely sure I remember.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, related to what you were saying, is that we have searched and searched and searched for a true two-women relationship. And there's next to none, and even if there is, they don't talk about anything.
Yeah, Game of Thrones, for a show that has an immense amount of compelling women characters, barely passes the Bechdel test. It does not pass as much as you think it should.
No, there's a conversation between Caitlin and Brienne.
Yes, about the girls.
About nothing, really. It's when they first meet. And
there's a later one that's about
says,
the girls.
"Hi, Lady Brienne, I like you." And Lady Brienne says, "I'm no lady, just call me Brienne."
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and later it's about the girls, but that relationship was much better in the book.
It was, yeah. And also, so for the listeners, we chose about, I think, 9 episodes that we actually rewatched in preparation for this. So there's going to be some things that are going to be rooted in a lot of detail based on episodes we've seen recently, and some things that are vague memories from things we watched a decade ago.
Only 9 years for me, because I was always a year behind.
True. In the last season, I think there are scenes with Sansa and Arya that pass.
But they... I really don't know how much they do. As somebody said, whether they're acting it out for Littlefinger or not acting it out, they're still sparring with each other like a 10 and an 8-year-old.
Right. And a lot of it is, related to Littlefinger and how they're kind of maneuvering that. There's a truly fantastic scene with Olenna Tyrell and Marjorie talking to Sansa.
Right.
And I think it's a great scene, but it is very much like them trying to find out from her basically what Marjorie's getting herself into with marrying Joffrey. And, there's also, I think that interaction between Sansa and Cersei, it's not nice, but I think it's a great scene. But again, they're talking about men and their relationship with men in a kind of combination of general and specific ways.
And there's the War Council, which I totally don't remember reading or seeing, but I saw it on YouTube, so it exists.
Right. So then in the kind of later seasons with Daenerys, there's a bit where she ends up basically allying with this whole kind of crowd of women. So it's Olenna Tyrell and Yara Greyjoy and...
There's the Sand Sister mother.
Yes, Elia?
I think so.
Elenia? Something like that.
Martell. Mrs. Martell. Dr. Martell.
I think she actually is also Sand.
Oh, okay. I thought she was Oberyn Martell's something.
Well, yes, but I think she's also...
The Dornish people.
Yes, the Dornish people who are,
The beautiful Dornish.
Yes, although the Sand Snakes are also wasted in the TV show, which is a different problem.
Yes, they are.
But then there's also the thing that, so, you do have this war council and you do have this interesting kind of hint at this possibility of a kind of women alliance, of a kind of alliance between women and women's rulership. But I also have a lot of problems with how the show really squanders that in terms of the ways in which the show, I think, basically goes from 0 to 60 in terms of making Daenerys Targaryen insane and cruel in a way that she, I think, is not without provocation and is not to people who are really genuinely innocent.
Well, I looked up today because I remember that, like the Spartacus movie book, she had basically crucified all the slavers in Marine.
But they're slavers.
It's not only that. I looked it up. When she got to Marine, they had crucified 100 children and arranged them that she would see them pointing the direction to the Marine. So she's responding to that. The things she does that and setting that whole house afire, where the place where they wanted to put her in the house for wives.
Dothraki, yeah.
I mean, it seems so excessive and crazy, and then you think about it, and maybe it's not. These really were bad people who had done bad things. So I can't tell if anything led up to it.
That's the thing, is that I think, at least in terms of how it ended up playing out in the show, it really felt to me like her attack on King's Landing, which continued after they'd surrendered and which involved murdering tons of innocent civilians, felt really out of character and didn't feel justified by anything that they had done with her character, any development that they'd actually done.
Swore that she wouldn't do that. She swore she wouldn't do that when she had that council of war with the women. Mm-hmm. And she swore she wouldn't do that when she had a meeting with Tyrion right before. So she twice swore. Well, the second time she didn't swore. She sort of avoided it. But, you sort of hoped she was agreeing not to slaughter innocent people. But on the other hand, all these women, she had it's that Cersei has a thing, not her, but a lot of people women have been accused of and probably did do very, very terrible things. I mean, Catherine de Medici has always been accused of starting the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which was basically a civil war between the Protestants and the Catholics. It wasn't a war.
Well, there was a civil war, and then she just did a massacre.
Yeah, because they massacred the Huguenots. I mean, and she is arguably, except for Jean Plady, everybody else, I think, believes she's behind that.
And that I will say is the thing is that bothers me, is that so when you're looking at medieval and early modern source material, I think it is actually...
primary material from the time?
Yes, primary material from the time. I think it is very clear that there is a hostility toward and willing to denigrate and present as irrational and present as insanely cruel in various ways women rulers.
Remember the horse and Catherine, the Empress of Russia, on the horse.
Right, or that they have these kind of bizarre sexual appetites, according, so that Catherine of the Great, and later in Russia is claimed to have had sex with their horse. That I think there is this need to denigrate women rulers as there being something deeply wrong with them that happens in a lot of medieval and early modern primary source material, and that's something that one of the tasks of historians working on these medieval rulers, women rulers, is to tease out, what's real and what's a way of insulting them, but also that even in the cases where some of them certainly were ruthless and not great people, but in what ways are they being treated differently from men who behaved in very similar ways?
That's my point. Do you think that part of the issue is that men do something, women do the same, but it's a problem when women do it because women aren't supposed to act that way?
I think that's definitely at least part of it, yeah. As I said, I think a lot of the nasty things that are said about real medieval women rulers, I think some of them are made up, but I think a lot of them are basically things that a man would not be vilified for in the same way.
Yes, absolutely.
That for men, that kind of ruthlessness was dedication and perseverance and strength. And in a woman, it's this crazy bitch.
I don't understand why anybody vilifies Isabel the She-Wolf. Well, I guess Isabel of France. What you call her, Isabel of the She-Wolf, you've given it. But she got rid of a terrible ruler. Everybody hated him.
Right. I mean, Edward undoubtedly was giving too much power to people based on his personal relationships with them.
Yes, the nobles all hated him. Why isn't she a hero?
Right. But, and that's very much is that, basically she is a woman who, cheated on and then was involved in the murder of her husband. But honestly, if it,
orchestrate, I think involved is a little.
Yes.
I mean, even her son hated her. She put her son on the throne, her son hated her.
Right, but, plenty of men who deposed bad rulers and took over in their stead are not treated the same way that she is.
Right.
And so, that's very much something that, so there are ways in which I think, Game of Thrones does kind of interesting things in terms of, a character like Cersei who is vilified for good reason, but is to some extent rendered partially sympathetic. But on the other hand, I think especially when you get into that last season, I think the way in which they deal with Daenerys feels basically just like the showrunners are reproducing those same disgusting misogynist tropes about women rulers that we see medieval chroniclers doing.
The difference is Cersei is terrible, and she has her flaws. I mean, her weaknesses. The fact that she cannot control her son, starting from the very beginning, when I think you're supposed to believe that she did reach a deal that Ned Stark would be sent to the wall, and Joffrey has his head cut off. I don't think she's behind that. And then there's another scene that we watched where they try to kill Tyrion during Blackwater. And then there's a later one, which we didn't watch for this podcast, where he goes to Cersei and says, was it you? There's only two people who can give orders to the Kingsguard, because the person who tried to kill the Kingsguard.
Yeah.
So it's gotta be one or the other.
Yeah.
And she doesn't say anything. He says, gotta be Joffrey. She has no control over him whatsoever. But anyway, if I could get back to the end of my sentence, we don't have to like her, but you sort of love her as a character.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Daenerys has that. I don't think you love her, and the end of it is just lazy writing.
Yeah, and I think that is definitely part of that, is that I have issues with her ending, but I think Cersei is actually an exquisitely developed character, and I think Daenerys, in like the last season, they got lazy, gave up, and said, we want to get her to the point where she's a crazy person, and they didn't do the work to actually get her there.
Right.
Which is just, by the way, it also, like, I mean, it's not deliberate, but it's this weird mirroring that you have these medieval chronicles that are extremely flattering of these women when they're the king's wife or daughter or sister, and then she's in charge, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, no, she's garbage, funny. And we hate her.
But it's the same. It's why I think it's just lazy. Everything Cersei did, you can imagine, she did this, and then in the last thing, all she does is look out the window. You have what would be foreshadowing if you thought the writers knew what they were doing, that she's looking out basically that same window and watching the sept blow up. But she planned that. She wanted it. She was taking revenge. She worked very hard. She found the leftover, wildfire. And then at the end, she just looks out the same window, has a chugging her wine, and has no thoughts, no ideas, no plan, no nothing. I don't believe it. Well, how did this woman become paralyzed in the face of danger?
And that's the big flaw in that last episode, The Bells, is that I think their characterization of pretty much all of the major women characters in that episode completely goes out the window. Daenerys is nuts out of nowhere. Cersei completely loses her agency and becomes completely powerless, as does Arya.
Oh, see, I'm not sure I agree.
About this episode, they were like, basically like, well, we want to like have somebody who we can follow the destruction through, who's like essentially being treated as this like ordinary person. I really much feel like it's a way that we've seen Arya grow out of being powerless, and for 8 seasons that has been Arya's arc, and then they return her to this extreme powerlessness.
It's not even totally that. It's since when has Sandor Clegane spent 8 years wanting to take revenge on his brother? He has never said that once. So the whole conversation's ridiculous.
Right, and then he says to Arya, oh, you don't want to be like me. And then she's like, oh, yeah, sure, okay, and just leaves. If she'd stayed in that room for like 15 minutes more, she could have killed Cersei and then left, and would have probably been in the exact same situation.
But the problem is that also the White Horse. I mean, I saw a movie where the White Horse was like the dead mother of these young children, taking them back to where they came from in Ireland, and that's really the only thing I could think of. That White Horse, which is so clean.
Right.
That's like our dead mother. So clean. The spirit of Catelyn Stark. What is he doing there?
Right, and yet it's just, and it's really just is like, so Arya kills the Night King in the episode before that? 2 episodes before that?
No, I think the Night King was like a whole different season. That's what was so dumb about the whole thing.
No, that's that season.
Oh, it was early.
It was earlier in that season, but it was that season.
But it was the whole thing. I mean,
that season was so rushed.
That's like a whole
is the other problem.
Starting from the very beginning, this show is about the North has to defend Westeros against the White Walkers. Well, the battle takes 5 minutes and we're done. Let's go home and worry about something else for the next 4 episodes. Bye.
Right. But it is. I do feel like they gave Arya, who is a character that I love, and Arya murdering all of the Freys is like the most moment. I've ever actually stood up and out loud cheered at anything ever. And I did it again when I rewatched it, and when Arya murders Walder Frey and then says by the way, I am Arya Stark.
The
that's
only time
so
I've
satisfying.
Ever stood up and applauded and really hurt my back was when Notre Dame beat UCLA's 100-game basketball winning streak.
My version of that moment is Arya Stark murdering Walder Frey.
And then she did it again the beginning of next season. It was very confusing.
Well, so the next season she is Walder Frey. She's wearing his face.
Right. It was very confusing.
But And that's good too, but there really was something about like where he's like, I keep calling my dumb sons. Where are my dumb sons? And she's like, they're right here, my lord.
And that comes straight out of Shakespeare.
In the pie.
And that comes and he stole it. What's Titus Andronicus, Greek or Roman?
Roman, and that's a Shakespeare play, but he
he got it from the Romans. So that, you know,
yes.
I mean, Martin is an equal opportunity homage.
Well, and it's also, and that has Greek roots. I mean, Medea murdered her sons and fed them to her father.
Pie.
I don't think the Greeks really did pies.
Yes, they do. They did them in phyllo.
Maybe it was a phyllo pie.
Have a spanakopita.
Have a spanakopita. Your sons are in it.
But yeah, so at any rate, no, that was great. But, you know, on the other hand, are you supposed to think that when Arya doesn't kill Cersei, that it's a growth moment? It's hard to see it it's because she's going to die. I mean, those are her choices. I mean, assuming she believes Clegane, and I think she does, those are her choices. Stay here, kill Cersei, and die, or give it up and have a nice life.
But then we watch the episode, and I actually don't think that even makes sense based on how they play out the episode, because if she stayed in the room for 10 minutes, she could have killed Cersei. I mean, Cersei has many immense skills, but, like, military ones are not among them. Like, Arya could kill her in a minute.
Clegane probably would have been, well, the whole idea of Clegane dumping Cersei to go fight with his brother when he really doesn't even have a brain is ridiculous.
Yes, but given that that's how they set it up, if she'd followed him, she could have just murdered Cersei while zombie Clegane was paying zero attention because he had stopped giving a shit. And then she probably, as I said, that would have delayed her by like 5 minutes, and I don't actually buy that would have made a difference.
See, what I thought was more interesting was her trying to save that woman and daughter, and by trying to save them, they die.
Yes, and that bothers me too, actually.
Yes,
that really bothers me that she is set up in that, like, I wouldn't have bothered her. It wouldn't have bothered me that, like, she's kind of going through this and she's, like, suffering and in pain and having a hard time. It wouldn't have bothered me if she'd, like, saved somebody or something. That it just felt like she was so helpless she was helpless. She couldn't protect herself and essentially survived by accident. She couldn't protect anyone else, and even her helping them, in fact, actually arguably, like, made them die faster, or at least certainly didn't help. And that just really bothered me, is that it just made her helpless and incompetent in a way that we'd seen 8 seasons of her becoming not that. It kind of turned her back into basically this like little girl who couldn't protect herself or anyone else. And I hated it.
What about her end? The fact that
she goes ridiculous.
off and becomes that she and Grey Worm are going to different places and they're both Robinson Crusoe? What the hell was that all about?
Oh, no, it's ridiculous. And there's no justification for that being what Arya wanted. I actually think it would have made much more sense for Arya to have been the thing that the end that I, and this is kind of getting ahead of, you know, some other things, but to talk about in the episode, but the end that I actually would have wanted to see for Arya, that I think would have made more sense with her character, would have been to see Arya as basically Sansa's Kingsguard.
You know, I can't see that because I honestly cannot see Arya working for anybody. I think Arya has a real problem. I don't think they found the right solution, but the problem with Arya is that she really does have to be totally independent, and I don't know what she could possibly have been doing.
Right. I think that might have worked. I think it would have been an interesting way to handle their relationship and their eventual, like, kind of coming to work together. And, like, almost Arya as a basically kind of, like, combo, like, hand/Kingsguard.
But Arya doesn't really have the know-it-all and plan. I don't know what she should be. I think she should be like a hired assassin.
I mean, you could have that be the case. A hired assassin is not. I think
Take
hired
her back
assassin.
To Bravos. Have her run Bravos.
I think a hired assassin as the Kingsguard for Sansa Stark makes more sense than Bronn as Master of Coin.